I've been huddled in this corner of a half-ruined clinic for hours now, scribbling frantically in a blood-spattered logbook. It's the only paper I could find that isn't already stained with someone else's memories. Angela would have mocked me for it, said I was acting like some Victorian diarist cataloging the fall of civilization. But I need to remember what happened before the world completely disintegrates. My name is James Collins, 28, EMT ambulance driver. In another life, one where my spine had more steel and less bend, I might have become a doctor. Instead, I found my calling in the howling sirens and red-splashed nights, yanking strangers back from death's doorstep one ride at a time. It was my compromise with medicine, close enough to feel useful, far enough to avoid turning into my father. Dr. Mark Collins would call my career choice a tragic waste of intellectual resources. That's the sanitized version. We haven't spoken since I walked out of medical school 3 years ago, leaving behind his disappointed scowl and my half-finished degree. The truth crawls beneath my skin like the things I've seen tonight. Hospitals remind me too much of Caleb, my younger brother, frozen in an 18-year-old body for nearly a decade, lying in a coma after the crash that should have killed us both. The antiseptic smell, the mechanical heartbeat of monitors, they all resurrected him in the worst way, made him a ghost that haunted every hospital corridor. But perhaps I'm lying to myself. Maybe what really terrified me was the fear that one day I'd look in a mirror and see my father's clinical detachment staring back. The night started with disturbing normalcy. A Tuesday evening, the sky a bruised purple threatening rain. Angela Carter sat beside me in the rig, her coffee brown hair pinned back from her face as usual. 4 years as partners had taught us each other's rhythms. Her dark humor that bloomed in proportion to a situation's grimness, my tendency to retreat into silence when calls went sideways. We'd just pulled into the lot of a 24-hour diner. Angela was fishing for exact change, a ritual she performed with religious precision. Just use a card like a normal person, I said, watching her count pennies. She shot me a look that could have curdled milk. When the apocalypse comes, Collins, your plastic won't save you. The radio crackled. Dispatch's voice slicing through our banter. Unit 17, possible psych case at 331 Pinecrest Towers. Male occupant talking to non-existent persons, unresponsive to direct questions. Our eyes locked. Pinecrest was the crown jewel of the city's skyline, where the wealthy paid obscene amounts to live slightly closer to heaven. Angela's mouth twisted into that half-smile of hers. So much for your pie, she said, gesturing toward the ignition. Something about the call nagged at my instincts. Psych evaluations typically went to specialized crisis teams, not general EMTs like us. But before I could voice my concern, Angela was already reaching for the lights. I should have listened to that twinge of wrongness. Should have radioed back, claimed mechanical issues, anything. Instead, I cranked the wipers against the sudden downpour and pointed our headlights toward Pinecrest Towers, toward the moment our reality fractured. The security guard who met us looked like he'd aged a decade in the past hour. His tie hung askew, and sweat had turned his uniform shirt translucent in patches. It's 18B, he stammered, eyes darting past us toward the lobby doors. Something's wrong with his voice. It keeps changing. Like different people are speaking through him. Angela placed a steadying hand on the man's shoulder. We'll handle it, she assured him, but the glance she threw my way said, this is already weird as fuck. The elevator ride up felt like ascending into another dimension. 18th floor. The corridor stretched before us, all plush carpet and subdued lighting that probably cost more per month than my rent. The door to 18B stood barely open, exhaling stale air into the hallway. Inside, darkness pooled in every corner. My flashlight beam caught dust motes swirling like miniature galaxies. In the center of the living room, a figure crouched on all fours, rocking slightly. Sir? I kept my voice neutral, non-threatening. We're here to help. His head snapped toward us with a sound like cracking vertebrae. In the harsh light, his pupils were black holes, consuming everything. "Who are you?" he asked, voice hollow as an abandoned well. Then softer. "Who am I?" Angela approached him with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield. "I'm Angela, and this is James. We're with City EMS. Can you tell us your name?" The laugh that erupted from his throat was the sound of metal scraping bone. My flashlight caught something beneath his skin, a rippling movement like fish darting just below the surface. "Why would you need my name?" the man said, his voice suddenly octaves higher, feminine and breathy. "When I'm not even here." Every nerve ending screamed to retreat. Call for backup. Let someone with more armor and fewer nightmares handle this. But protocol chained us to duty. I inched closer, one hand hovering near my radio. The man's eyes locked onto mine with terrible recognition. "I saw you," he hissed, saliva threading between his lips. "I saw you in the waiting place." Ice crystallized in my veins. "Sir, I don't—" "They're coming," he whispered, pupils dilating until only a thin corona of iris remained. "And they remember your name, James Collins." In the same moment, his skull collapsed inward, as if crushed by invisible hands. Blood trickled from his ears, nose, eyes, every opening suddenly weeping crimson. He crumpled sideways like a marionette with severed strings. A siren tore through the night, not the familiar wail of emergency services, but something primordial. It felt ancient and wrong, like the death scream of something that should never have existed. Angela's face drained of color. "What the hell is that?" We fled the apartment, abandoning the body and protocol in one panicked stride. The ambulance waited below, a red and white sanctuary that suddenly seemed as fragile as tissue paper. Angela cranked the heat with trembling fingers, her breathing short and shallow. The radio erupted with chaos, not dispatch's controlled voice, but a cacophony of terror. "My husband's eyes," a woman sobbed. "They're not his eyes anymore." Speaking in tongues, she's tearing at her skin. "They just started walking, all of them, all at once." Then, cutting through the panic like a scalpel, my brother's voice, Caleb's voice. "James, don't look at their faces. They're not who they appear to be." My hands went numb on the wheel. "Angela, did you hear that?" The question emerged strangled, unrecognizable. She shook her head, eyes fixed on the radio's pulsing light. Hear what? Caleb had been functionally brain-dead for nearly a decade. There was no way his voice had just emerged from our radio. And yet, "James," Angela's voice pulled me back. "Where do we go?" I stomped the gas, the only plan forming in fragments. "Hospital. Find out if there's a command center established." City streets had transformed in the minutes since we'd answered the call. Digital billboards flashed urgent warnings. Emergency protocol engaged. Stay indoors. Lock windows and doors. Await instructions. No details, no explanation. If they'd known what lurked behind those locked doors, maybe the message would have been different. Run, hide, pray. As we swerved around an abandoned SUV, memories of my father infected my thoughts like a virus. Dr. Mark Collins, in his immaculate white coat, eyes remote as he adjusted monitors around Caleb's bed. I'd been barely 19 when the accident happened, newly enrolled in the pre-med program that would make me the third generation of Collins physicians. Dad forbade tears in Caleb's room. Emotional displays serve no medical purpose, he'd say, voice as sterile as his instruments. The region's most renowned neurologist couldn't save his own son, or wouldn't accept that some people aren't meant to be saved. He descended into obsession, his research growing more experimental, more desperate. I began to suspect Caleb had transformed from son to specimen in our father's eyes, his comatose body the perfect canvas for radical theories about consciousness. That suspicion drove me from medicine. I walked away from our family legacy, from the cold precision of my father's world, only to end up here, still surrounded by blood and broken bodies, just from a different angle. "James, look." Angela pointed toward the horizon where City General Hospital's silhouette was crowned with writhing black smoke. Shit. If our main medical center was compromised, where else could we go? I veered down side streets, consulting the mental map I'd built over years of emergency calls. Mercy West Hospital sat on the city outskirts. Smaller, older, but potentially safer. Angela's phone buzzed. Somehow, cellular networks still functioned. She activated speaker. Angela, thank Christ. It was Billy from our station, his voice frayed with panic. Don't go near City General. It's overrun. What do you mean, overrun? Angela pressed the phone closer. Patients, staff, they're changing. Some immediately, others slowly. Some are still themselves, but... His breath hitched. They're killing each other in there. I only got out because I was in the parking garage. What about dispatch? They've gone dark. We're trying to establish triage at Mercy West on 14th. There's a skeleton crew. Billy, what the hell is happening? Angela's voice cracked. People are calling them zombies, but that's not right. They talk. They remember my sister, his voice broke. She told me about things I never did, but she swore it was me. Said she recognized my face from someplace else. The call dissolved into static. Angela lowered the phone, her eyes haunted. Mercy West, she murmured, more to herself than to me. I gripped the wheel until pain shot through my fingers. We'll get there, I promised. We'll figure this out. Mercy West materialized through sheets of rain. Its brick facade dark except for scattered emergency lights. The ambulance bay doors were chained shut. Bad sign. I pounded on a side entrance until a wild-eyed nurse appeared. EMS, I shouted through the glass. We need to get inside. She fumbled with locks, hands shaking so badly she dropped the keys twice. Hurry, she hissed when the door finally cracked open. They're inside. The nurse led us through dim corridors where emergency lighting cast more shadows than illumination. Abandoned equipment cluttered the hallways. A wheelchair sat empty, one wheel still spinning lazily. Most people fled, she explained, or died. A few of us barricaded in the old triage area, but they broke through eventually. Where's the triage area? Angela asked, already scanning for threats. Follow me, the nurse whispered, moving with the furtive steps of someone who'd learned the hard way that sound attracts predators. The triage ward was a battlefield aftermath. Bleeding survivors sprawled across makeshift bedding while a young doctor moved between them, applying bandages with mechanical repetition. His eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone operating on pure muscle memory. Angela immediately moved to assist him. I sought information from a paramedic I recognized slumped against the wall, a vacant expression suggesting his mind had partially checked out from reality. They brought in the first wave around sunset, he said. Voice scraped raw, confused, violent. Then they started, transforming, some faster than others. Staff reported seeing ghosts, hearing voices. Then they began attacking, themselves, us, anyone. Some spoke like they were channeling other people. We tried sedation, restraints. Nothing worked. They'd just get back up. A scream tore through the ward, silencing him mid-sentence. A patient on a nearby cot began convulsing violently, veins bulging beneath skin like desperate creatures trying to escape. Medical staff rushed to restrain him, but he thrashed with unnatural strength. Someone shouted for sedatives. The young doctor shook his head. We're out. The man's eyes snapped open. Not human eyes anymore, but voids of absolute darkness. His mouth worked, producing guttural sounds that resembled no language I'd ever heard. Then, without warning, he went completely still. A nurse approached cautiously. I think he's... The patient jackknifed upright, seizing her wrist. She screamed as staff scrambled to pull him off. He whispered something directly into her ear, something that drained all color from her face. She collapsed seconds later, unresponsive. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Angela pressing fingertips against her temple. Sweat beaded along her hairline as if she were fighting some internal battle. When she caught my concerned gaze, she forced a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm fine," she mouthed silently. We tried helping where we could, but the chaos only intensified. The adjacent corridor revealed more evidence of the hospital's collapse. Overturned equipment, shattered glass. From partially open doors came moans and whispers. Patients in various stages of transformation, pleading for help or threatening violence in voices not their own. Our small group, Angela, me, 2 paramedics, and the young doctor who introduced himself as Marcus, huddled to strategize when a weak voice called from nearby. "Help, anyone." We found a middle-aged man wearing a blood-soaked lab coat slumped against the wall in what appeared to be a small research laboratory. A half-torn ID badge identified him as Dr. Sherman. He clutched a key card in trembling fingers, relief flickering across his face when he saw us. "Paramedics," he gasped, the word emerging wet with blood. "Thank God." I knelt beside him, examining the wound, a gaping hole in his abdomen that no amount of medical intervention could repair. Still, I pressed a compress against it. "We'll get you help," I lied, because sometimes lies are kinder than truth. "Listen carefully," he wheezed, each syllable a struggle. "My name is Dr. Sherman. I was part of the Omega Initiative. We never intended this catastrophe." Angela stiffened beside me. "The Omega Initiative?" Dr. Sherman's breath rattled like loose change in his chest. "Government contract. Studying comatose patients, trying to restore neural pathways." Blood bubbled at the corners of his mouth. "But we discovered something. Consciousness isn't just neural firing, it's code, stored outside the physical brain." "Slow down," I urged, though my pulse quickened. This sounded disturbingly similar to my father's fringe theories. "We learned to manipulate that code," Sherman continued, desperation lending strength to his fading voice. "Force reawakening in patients who showed no brain activity. Initial trials seemed miraculous. But then some awakened with memories that weren't theirs. Multiple consciousnesses, layered like sedimentary rock. It wasn't them behind the eyes anymore." He pressed the blood-stained keycard into my palm. "We tried containing it, refining the process. But someone," a wet cough interrupted him. "Someone decided it was time for a mass field test. They turned the entire city into a laboratory." Angela's face drained of color. "You're saying they infected a population of 500,000 people, on purpose?" Sherman nodded weakly. "They believed with the right trigger, a specific frequency embedded in the emergency broadcast, they could catalyze a controlled reawakening in comatose patients citywide. Instead, they opened a door for the dead." His fingers dug into my wrist with surprising strength. "We don't know who or what is returning in these bodies. We call them reawakened. But it's unpredictable, chaotic, spreading exponentially." His eyes burned with feverish intensity. "You don't wake the dead unless you're prepared for what comes back with them." His gaze moved toward Angela, something like recognition passing across his face, then back to me. 7th floor, research laboratory. The key card grants access." Another cough racked his body, weaker this time. "Find the inhibitor serum. It's the only defense." He drew a final shuddering breath. "Stop them, or it spreads beyond the city." Then he was gone, eyes fixed on some distant point only the dying can see. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts circled back to my father's obsession with neurological research, his government contracts, his endless experiments on comatose patients, on Caleb. Could he have been part of this? Was his desperation to revive my brother connected to whatever was happening? I turned to Angela, the key card slick with blood in my grip. "We have to go." She nodded, her expression unreadable. Marcus insisted on accompanying us, while the remaining staff chose to fortify the triage area. We couldn't blame them. As we climbed the nearest stairwell, the 3rd-floor landing presented our first serious obstacle. A figure swaying at the corridor's end, one hand trailing along the wall. It moaned, a sound like radio static forced through human vocal cords. Marcus raised a placating hand. "Sir, we're medical staff." The reawakened's head snapped toward us with a sickening crack of vertebrae. Its lips peeled back in a grotesque approximation of a smile before it charged with unnatural velocity. As it clawed at Marcus, Angela surged forward, driving her elbow into the creature's throat. It staggered sideways. I seized Marcus's arm and propelled us forward, sprinting past the momentarily disoriented thing. Its shriek followed us, a sound like metal being torn apart. Adrenaline carried us up 4 more flights of stairs. By the time we reached the 7th floor, the howls had faded to distant echoes. Marcus slumped against the wall, chest heaving. Angela pressed her fingertips against her temple again, swallowing hard. "Just a migraine," she muttered before I could ask. The 7th floor stood eerily quiet, though distant shuffling sounds emanated from unseen rooms. Most doorways bore standard department labels, but one caught my attention. A reinforced door with a keypad beside an unmarked plaque. It had the unmistakable solemnity of restricted access. I swiped Dr. Sherman's keycard. The light flashed red, then green. The laboratory beyond stretched cold and sterile under strobing emergency lights. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with vials and meticulously labeled files. Computer terminals flickered at various workstations. The floor bore dried bloodstains in patterns that resembled some arcane language. Marcus moved to the nearest desk, rifling through papers with growing horror. Angela approached a heavy metal door at the far end of the room. I surveyed documents spread across a central table, detailed experiments on comatose patients, EEG readouts with alarming anomalies, references to memory transference, and synaptic reseeding. My fingers brushed a singed file labeled Project EEG, my initials. My stomach dropped into freefall. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside lay medical data about a patient identified as James Collins. Brain scans, references to a near-fatal accident, a coma lasting 3 days. My father's signature on every page. One line seared itself into my consciousness. Patient clinically deceased for 4 minutes, 39 seconds before experimental intervention led to successful revival. Deceased? I had died for nearly 5 minutes. My father had always insisted I emerged from the crash with minor injuries. A concussion, some broken bones. That Caleb had absorbed the worst impact, which explained his persistent coma. He never once mentioned that I had flatlined on the operating table. Notes referenced constructing a stable consciousness and mimetic imprint from original subject. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If I died, if they reconstructed me, was I even the real James Collins? The floor tilted beneath me, reality receding. Angela's sharp gasp yanked me back to the present. She'd opened the metal door to reveal a small storage room. Inside, a glass cabinet held vials of amber liquid, but it wasn't the vials that prompted her reaction. It was the body slumped against the cabinet. A lab technician with vacant eyes and a bullet hole where his heart should be. Marcus confirmed what we already knew. Shot execution style. Someone wanted these protected. Angela carefully extracted one vial, studying the label. Inhibitor X9. She turned to me, her face pale as parchment. Is this what Sherman mentioned? The defense against whatever's happening? I struggled to process my own discovery while making sense of the vials. But the pieces aligned into a terrifying picture. An inhibitor to prevent the reawakening process. Our only defense against whatever was consuming the city. Angela secured several vials in her bag, while Marcus found a sealed case with identical labels. As we prepared to leave, Angela suddenly doubled over, a cry of pain escaping her lips. Her hand flew to her temple as agony twisted her features. I rushed to support her. Angela? Her eyes seemed unfocused, gazing at something beyond physical reality. I'm fine, she forced through clenched teeth. Angela then pulled away, fumbling in her bag until she produced a syringe filled with clear liquid. Without hesitation, she plunged it into her thigh. I stared, bewildered. What the hell was that? She avoided my gaze. Nothing, just migraine medication. Before I could press further, the laboratory door rattled. Something scraped against metal, fingernails or claws seeking entrance. Marcus signaled for silence. If that thing wanted in, it would eventually succeed. We needed another exit. We eased the door open, praying for an empty corridor. Instead, a tall figure stood at the hallway's end, silhouetted against emergency lights. Even from 20 feet away, I could see its eyes. Luminous pools that reflected light like an animal's. We froze. The figure tilted its head, listening to some inaudible frequency. Then it released a static-laced hiss and launched itself toward us. We bolted in the opposite direction, plunging deeper into labyrinthine hallways. Adrenaline temporarily overrode the shock of my father's deception and my own questionable existence. Footfalls pounded behind us, gaining with every heartbeat. The thing moved with inhuman purpose. Angela gestured frantically toward a service corridor marked by a battered metal door. Marcus hammered the elevator button. The creature's footsteps grew closer, accompanied by that bizarre clicking sound, like bone against metal. The doors separated by a fraction of an inch. We wedged our fingers into the gap, forcing them apart enough to squeeze through. Before the doors slid closed, I caught a final glimpse of our pursuer rounding the corner. Gaunt face, blackened veins writhing beneath translucent skin. Its eyes locked onto mine, jaw working soundlessly as if trying to form words it remembered, but couldn't speak. Recognition flickered there. Then the elevator doors sealed us in darkness. We lurched downward with a metallic shriek. Angela's gaze met mine in the dim emergency lighting. Something in her eyes had changed, a quality I couldn't name but recognized on some primal level. "James," she whispered, her voice suddenly different. Familiar in a way that made my blood run cold. "Don't you recognize me? It's Caleb." The elevator continued its descent into darkness, carrying us toward whatever waited below. The sub-basement greeted us like an open grave. Marcus traced a route on a faded evacuation map, his dirt-smudged fingers trembling. "Loading dock," he whispered. "If we can reach it, we might live another hour," I finished for him. Angela hung back, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something inside. She'd been silent since we'd fled the lab, and I couldn't wait any longer. I stepped toward her. "Angela, what was in that injection?" "I told you. Migraines." Her fingers twisted a loose thread on her sleeve until it cut into her skin. "Bullshit." The word echoed off the pipes. "Dr. Sherman mentioned a serum that inhibits reawakening." "Is that what you've been taking?" When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "James, I didn't..." She swallowed. "I wasn't sure it would ever get this far." Marcus edged closer, his body tensing as if preparing to restrain her. Nightmares that weren't mine. Angela's eyes flashed with something feral. Voices that knew my name. Sometimes I'd remember dying. She licked her cracked lips. I recognized the warning signs. Someone in the program slipped me this experimental dose. It stops the progression or slows it down. My blood turned to ice water. How long? A week, maybe. She met my stare, chin lifted in defiance. Anger and betrayal twisted in my gut. "We're supposed to be partners." Her voice hardened. "Don't you get it? Everything's coming apart. I didn't want to lose the only real friend I have left." She nodded at the vials nestled in her bag. "That's why I needed to get to the lab. I needed more inhibitor. It's the only way I stay, me." A metallic crash echoed through the corridor before I could respond. We froze. Breath held. Marcus signaled toward a passage that might lead to the loading dock. I took point, my thoughts fracturing between focused survival and the horrifying knowledge burning in my mind. Angela was infected, taking black market serum to stay human. What was the line between us and them now? A shadow slid around a distant corner. I flattened against the wall, one hand raised for silence. Angela and Marcus pressed themselves against me in the shallow alcove. I felt Angela's heart hammering against my back. Too fast, almost hummingbird quick. Not human, whispered a treacherous part of my mind. Uneven footsteps scraped the concrete. We inched forward past half-open doors. One bore a peeling morgue label. Another, research specimens, remained sealed with 3 separate locks. What nightmares did they keep behind those doors? Rounding another corner, we spotted it. The loading dock with its promise of escape. But between us and freedom huddled a cluster of reawakened. 4 figures with that same restless, twitching energy. One wore a nurse's uniform soaked in darkness. At their center stood a tall figure, its head cocked at an angle that made my stomach turn to liquid. Marcus's sharp inhale broke our silence. The tall figure ceased its movements with mechanical precision and rotated toward us, eyes glowing with that eerie luminescence we'd witnessed upstairs. A short woman in a stained lab coat snapped her head upward, locking eyes with me. The shriek that tore from her throat sent needles of pain through my eardrums. The others pivoted as one, synchronized like puppets sharing a single string. Run! Angela yanked my arm. We pounded down a side corridor, our footsteps betraying us while the reawakened pursued. Their wails bounced off concrete walls, multiplying until it seemed they surrounded us. We skidded around a corner only to face a locked steel door marked "Maintenance, no entry." Angela slammed her palm against it, cursing. The reawakened closed in, their footfalls a frenzied drumbeat. I drove my shoulder into the door, pain exploding across my collarbone. Again, nothing. Marcus joined me on the 3rd attempt. With a crack of splintering hinges, the door gave way to darkness. We tumbled inside, dragging the damaged door shut behind us. No lock. I braced my body against it, each breath scraping my lungs raw. The reawakened collided with the other side seconds later. Angela fumbled for her flashlight. We stood in a maintenance room cluttered with forgotten equipment. A high window offered a faint hope, perhaps leading outside. Marcus spotted a heavy metal shelf and gestured wordlessly. Together, we hauled it across the door. It wouldn't hold forever, but it bought us seconds, maybe minutes. In that cramped, dust-choked space, with death separated from us by a failing barricade, I found a strange island of calm. My hand brushed the file in my bag, Project EG. The words "patient clinically deceased" pulsed behind my eyes. My father's signature stained the bottom of those pages. Another memory flashed. Caleb's voice on the radio whispering, "Don't look at them. Maybe I died that day." The words escaped me unbidden. In the car accident, the notion felt simultaneously alien and familiar, like discovering you've been wearing someone else's skin your entire life. According to these files, I was constructed somehow, brought back, reawakened. Angela crawled toward me, her touch on my shoulder hesitant, like touching a bomb that might detonate. "James, what's wrong?" I extracted the partially burned file with numb fingers. "I found this in the lab. My father," my voice broke. "According to this, I died in the accident with Caleb. Dad used some experimental method, the same research that's causing all this. He revived me." Tears burned paths down my cheeks. "I don't even know what I am anymore." "James." Angela's face drained of color. "My father specialized in coma research. He was obsessed with saving my brother. But what if he tested the procedure on me first? What if I'm not me, just some patchwork of memories stuffed into a revived corpse?" Angela shook her head fiercely. "You're still you." But doubt clouded her eyes, and I saw her inch away from me. Dad must have continued his work secretly. Now someone has weaponized it citywide. That siren, some signal was broadcast, forcing partial awakenings. I looked up at Angela, my voice hollow. "My father's behind this, or he knows who is." A thunderous crash interrupted as the door splintered inward. Dust rained from the ceiling as the metal shelf groaned in protest. Our borrowed time was expiring. Marcus aimed his flashlight upward. There might be access panels. He climbed onto a crate, pushing at ceiling tiles until one gave way, revealing a narrow service crawl space. We stacked crates into a makeshift ladder. Marcus disappeared into the opening first, then helped pull Angela through. I stayed behind, bracing the door one final time. The shelf began to slide as the door bowed inward. A pale hand thrust through the widening gap, fingers contorted like claws. I scrambled up the crates, pulse hammering in my throat. Cold fingers brushed my ankle as I heaved myself into the darkness above, the touch sending electricity up my spine. Did I imagine that voice whispering my name? We replaced the ceiling tile and crawled through dust and cobwebs. The reawakened raged below us, their cries muffled by layers of building material. An amber glow filtered through ventilation grates. Perhaps dawn breaking, or perhaps the city burning. The crawl space led to a rooftop service platform. We emerged into open air that tasted of ash and chemicals. Far below, reawakened figures swarmed the streets, some wandering aimlessly, others in coordinated pursuit of fleeing survivors. We descended a fire escape to ground level behind the hospital complex. Our battered ambulance stood a block away, but between us and potential escape, at least a dozen reawakened forms drifted through shadow pools. We crouched behind a dumpster that reeked of rot and antiseptic. An electronic shriek cut through the air. We tensed, expecting another wave of disabling static. Instead, an emergency broadcast blared. Attention all survivors. Proceed to Haven Point Hospital in the Northern District. This is the last functioning safe zone. Do not engage the infected. Help is coming. Haven Point, my chest constricted. Dad's old workplace. If answers existed, they waited at Haven Point. If my father still lived, he'd be there. Angela's fingers dug into my forearm. James, this place is compromised. If that broadcast is legitimate, Haven Point might offer real help. Her voice dropped. Maybe answers about your father. I nodded, mouth dry. We need transportation. Marcus scanned the area. Our rig is probably still out front. That's suicide to reach. I glanced at Angela, noting how she massaged her temples. Another headache or something worse? We'll figure something out. But we're heading to Haven Point. Escaping Mercy West meant threading a path through hell. We crouched behind burnt-out vehicles, slipped through side streets littered with horrors. On one block, reawakened figures stood in a perfect semicircle, chanting overlapping words like a broken record player. Their voices synchronized, then fractured, like multiple radio stations playing through the same speaker. Join us, we remember your face from before you were born. Angela stayed within arm's reach, occasionally injecting herself with that translucent serum when she thought I wasn't watching. Each time her hands shook worse than before. I pretended not to notice how her pupils contracted unevenly, or how she sometimes mumbled responses to questions nobody had asked. They're calling to me, she whispered once, her voice childlike with fear. In my head, they know I'm halfway across. Marcus proved unexpectedly resourceful. He scavenged supplies from an abandoned ambulance wedged against a streetlight. I claimed the driver's seat, ignoring the spiderweb cracks in the windshield and the dark stains on the upholstery. The engine protested, coughed, then roared to life. We swerved onto the road, heading north toward Haven Point, zigzagging around the debris and abandoned vehicles. A woman cradling something wrapped in a bloody blanket stepped into our path. I swerved around her, catching a glimpse of her face through the windshield. Her eyes glowing with that unholy light, her mouth curved in a smile that wasn't meant for human lips. The bundle in her arms squirmed. The radio spat fragmented messages through bursts of static. Frightened civilians begging for help. Official voices issuing contradictory instructions. Then cutting through the chaos with crystal clarity. James, do you hear me? Caleb's voice as close as if he sat beside me. I jerked the wheel, nearly sideswiping a telephone pole. Angela cursed, bracing herself against the dashboard. "What the hell, James?" "Sorry." Sweat beaded on my forehead. My eyes darted to the radio, but only static remained. Had I imagined it? For a terrible moment, I wondered if infection had taken root in my own mind. If I heard the same phantoms that tormented the others. Or if I was never really me to begin with. "Are you okay?" Angela's question came softly. Despite everything, I saw genuine worry in her eyes. We reached Haven Point as dirty light crept above the horizon. The hospital rose behind high-security fences, hastily augmented with barbed wire. Floodlights swept the perimeter, manned by guards in mismatched uniforms. Some private security, others wearing police tactical gear. A few in what looked like military fatigues. We approached cautiously. A guard barked orders to halt, rifle raised. I rolled down my window, hands raised where they could see them, calling out that we were EMS seeking refuge. They waved us forward after a tense standoff. Inside the perimeter, chaos reigned beneath a veneer of order. The courtyard overflowed with shell-shocked survivors. Triage tents had been erected in haste. The compound reeked of sweat, fear, and industrial disinfectant. A recorded voice droned, "Do not make eye contact with the infected. Report any suspicious symptoms immediately. Haven Point is under quarantine. We will protect you. We will protect you." The words rang hollow. A promise made by those who had already failed us once. A woman in a bulletproof vest intercepted us, introducing herself as Captain Reyes. "EMTs? We need all the medical personnel we can get." She led us into the hospital's main atrium, transformed into a command center. Digital maps displayed spreading red zones across the city. I scanned faces, both dreading and hoping to see my father, but I saw no sign of Dr. Mark Collins among the doctors and administrators. Then a loudspeaker crackled overhead. "James Collins to the third-floor research wing immediately." Ice formed in my veins. That voice, calm, precise, unchanged by years of separation. My father's. Angela's fingers encircled my wrist, her grip steadying. "James," she whispered. "It's him, isn't it?" I nodded, mouth suddenly desert dry. The question hung unspoken between us. How did he know I was here? Angela refused to let me face him alone. We navigated toward the research wing, passing through increasingly sophisticated security checkpoints. The deeper we ventured, the more sanitized and pristine our surroundings became, a jarring contrast to the chaos outside. Retinal scanners, armed guards, and biosensor gates replaced simple ID checks. The final door bore a polished brass plaque. Dr. Mark Collins, Neurological Research. I pressed the intercom button, feeling Angela's presence at my shoulder like a physical warmth. A camera pivoted toward us before the lock disengaged with a pneumatic hiss. The laboratory beyond sprawled with cutting-edge technology. Monitors lined the walls, displaying brainwave patterns and medical data. Glass cabinets housed rows of color-coded vials. In the center, high-resolution screens showed real-time scans and complex chemical formulas. My father stood with his back to us, shoulders straight beneath his pristine lab coat. The years had etched new lines into him. Silver threading his dark hair, deeper creases marking his face when he turned. But his eyes remained unchanged, penetrating, analytical, dissecting me with a glance. "James," he said, his voice a controlled measure of warmth and clinical detachment. He stepped forward, studying me as if confirming I match some internal blueprint. "I knew you'd find your way here." Words died in my throat. Angela hovered protectively close. My father's gaze flicked to her, then back to me. "Your friend is infected," he stated flatly. Angela stiffened. "I'm stable," she countered, chin lifting. Dad nodded once. "The inhibitor. We've developed an improved formula here." He returned his attention to me, his expression softening fractionally. "I'm sorry about the city, James. This escalated beyond parameters." You unleashed hell on innocent people. He raised a hand. The gesture so familiar, it silenced me instantly. The original protocol called for contained trials with volunteer coma patients. Certain authorities decided to gather mass data by broadcasting the signal citywide. We lost control. I warned them the process wasn't ready for deployment. My fists clenched. So you admit it. You and your shadow backers reawakened thousands, the comatose, the already dead. Or let them be possessed by whatever these things are. He drew a measured breath. James, what do you remember about your accident? The abrupt change of subject knocked me off balance. Fragments, impact, pain. I lost consciousness, woke up with broken bones that healed. I swallowed. But your file said I was clinically dead for 4 minutes. You brought me back, Dad. You reawakened me. How can I know I'm still myself? Angela's grip tightened on my arm. My father's composure cracked for an instant, genuine emotion bleeding through. I never told you because I feared what it would do to you. Yes, you were clinically deceased. Caleb was in deep coma. I dedicated everything to saving you both. The experimental procedure succeeded with you. Your consciousness reintegrated fully. Memories intact. You exhibited no foreign infiltration. He approached slowly, placing a hand on my shoulder. The weight felt both alien and achingly familiar. You are James. You always have been. The only difference is that your consciousness was reseeded. Same mind, same soul, if you believe in that. Just granted a second chance. A second chance. Or a second life in a body that had already died once. The thought sent vertigo spinning through me. What about Caleb? Why couldn't you save him too? Pain tightened my father's features. Because when we attempted the procedure on him, something else slipped in. We had to sedate him more deeply. After that, our sponsors demanded expanded trials. I insisted we needed more refinement, more safeguards. They seized the research and perverted it. He gestured to the monitors displaying citywide chaos. They triggered a mass reawakening without proper containment protocols. Some subjects responded to their original memories. Others became vessels for fragments. Fragments of what? Angela's voice trembled. What the hell are these things? Consciousness without identity, my father answered. Dissociated awareness seeking form. Perhaps even, he hesitated. Perhaps consciousness from beyond our understanding of reality. Angela exhaled shakily. That's inhuman, and you just let it happen. He turned on her, unexpected fierceness in his reply. I tried to prevent it. They outmaneuvered me, launched a signal without final clearance. He sighed, indicating a sealed chamber beyond the glass partition. Caleb remains in there, still comatose. The sedation is wearing thin. I'm close to perfecting an inhibitor that might allow him to reawaken as himself. But I need time and resources the city can no longer provide. I approached the glass, peering through. Medical equipment hummed, connected to a figure on a hospital bed. Though shadows obscured his features, I recognized the profile. My brother's jawline. The unruly hair so like my own. Caleb, frozen in time while years passed. While I lived a borrowed life without him. Angela cleared her throat. If you have a working formula, share it. We could mass produce it, distribute it citywide. My father's laugh held no humor. You think it's that simple? The infection is evolving, rewriting neural pathways faster than we can synthesize treatment. Factions are actively sabotaging distribution efforts, possibly wanting to weaponize or control the reawakened. We can't simply aerosolize the inhibitor. It requires precise dosing, careful administration. His gaze hardened as it returned to Angela. Speaking of which, how long do you estimate your black market serum will maintain stability? Another day? 2? The formula you need exists, but it remains experimental. If you want to survive, we'll need to test it on you directly. She paled but nodded. That's why we came. There has to be a solution. I studied my father, wariness coiling in my gut. And you want my help? To gather data, test formulas on Angela and others? His eyes narrowed, evaluating me. Son, I'm asking you to help me fix what's broken. You have the medical training. You were exceptional before you abandoned medicine. Old resentment flared. I left because I couldn't stand to become you, Dad. Cold, clinical, willing to sacrifice others for the greater good. He didn't flinch. Perhaps that was true once. But moral high ground is a luxury we've lost, James. This is about survival now. The door behind us whispered open. 2 orderlies entered. Exhaustion evident in their postures. Dr. Collins, one reported, perimeter breaches in sectors 3, 7, and 9. We're reinforcing, but the situation is deteriorating rapidly. My father turned to me. Will you stand with me or not? The question hung between us, loaded with years of resentment and unspoken pain. Before I could answer, the overhead lighting flickered, the laboratory systems switching to backup power. On monitoring screens, red alerts multiplied across digital maps. Haven Point, our last refuge, was under attack. We rushed to the windows overlooking the courtyard. Below, chaos erupted as reawakened figures breached the perimeter fences. Security personnel formed defensive clusters, gunfire stuttering in irregular bursts. Some of the guards turned their weapons on each other, eyes glowing with that same inhuman light. We're out of time, my father hissed. A voice called from the corridor, Dr. Collins. Movement detected in the lower levels. They've penetrated the building. A nurse appeared in the doorway, eyes wild with terror. My father spun back toward us. We must administer the new serum immediately. The synthesis lab is 1 floor up. If we fail, we lose everything. I glanced at Angela, noting the pallor beneath her skin. She clutched her throat suddenly, as if struggling to breathe. James, she whispered, it's getting harder to know which thoughts are mine. A series of concussive blasts shook the building's foundation. Glass instruments shattered, monitors flickered, half going dark. Through the PA system came a recorded message, distorted by static. Phase 1 is complete. Initiating Phase 2. The blood drained from my father's face. They've activated Phase 2. My God, a wave of vertigo slammed into me without warning. Reality fractured. For a heartbeat, I wasn't standing in the lab. I lay on a hospital bed. Electrodes taped to my temples, harsh light burning my retinas. My father leaned over me, his voice urgent. He's responding. He's waking up. James, can you hear me? Then, like a snapped thread, I returned to the chaotic lab. Angela calling my name, the taste of copper flooding my mouth. I staggered to my feet, the world tilting beneath me. Over the speaker system came a voice I would recognize anywhere, Caleb's. Calm, almost peaceful. James, wake up, the phrase repeated twice before dissolving into electronic noise. Angela clutched my arm, steadying me. We need to move. They'll reach this floor any minute. Behind us, my father typed frantically at a console, copying files to a portable drive. He glanced over his shoulder, genuine fear breaking through his clinical mask. Son, we can save him. We can save everyone. But I need you. I stared at him, pulse thundering in my ears. Everything I thought I knew about myself hung in question. My partner fought an invisible battle against infection. My brother lay suspended between life and death, possibly broadcasting into my mind. The city crumbled under an onslaught of reanimated nightmares. The building shuddered from another explosion. Angela's hand trembled in mine, her skin fever hot. My father waited, eyes pleading. I opened my mouth to answer. Then everything flickered. The lights, the monitors, my vision. Darkness swallowed me. For a single heartbeat, I felt sheets beneath me, heard beeping machines, caught my father's frantic voice. He's seizing. Stabilize him. Quickly. Reality snapped back like a rubber band. I coughed, tasting blood. They both watched me, father and friend. 2 anchors in a maelstrom of uncertainty. Through the window, I saw a figure on a rooftop across the courtyard. It stood perfectly still amid the chaos, staring directly at our window. Even at this distance, I recognized the silhouette, identical to my own. The last words I heard before the generator failed completely came from my father, urgency stripping away his scientific detachment. We must begin the procedure now. Then darkness claimed everything. Maybe I was never awake at all. That's the end of this story. If you liked it, please consider subscribing. It would really help me out. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon.